Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc. All right, so today we're going to talk about chest to bar pull-ups and developing the capacity to improve on those, especially for athletes who are kind of in an in-between state where they can do the movement, they can get through them in workouts, they can maybe do them in an EMOM or, get a few good sets in if they have to do them with other movements, but chest to bar ends up being a significant weakness for them if they have to do high volume or if they're super tired. So we want to think about how we can actually progress this movement for an athlete who has some capacity but who struggles with it. And we're going to lay out a framework for thinking about this that is going to be applicable to all kinds of different movements. So even though this discussion is particularly going to be about chest to bar pull-ups, we can use similar concepts to think about improving handstand push-ups, to think about improving barbell cycling movements, to think about improving, muscle-ups, handstand walking, etc. So Luke, why don't you start us off and just give us a framework for how we should think about beginning to work on improving chest to bar pull-ups for this sort of hypothetical avatar of an athlete.
Yeah, so I think that, like you said, we can apply this model with other movements as well. But first off, I think you have to look at the movement itself. You have to have a look at the range of motion requirements, the movement freedom requirements for something like a chest to bar pull-up. So what are we looking at? We're looking at making sure that they have enough shoulder extension so they can actually pull themselves, or they can actually get their chest to the bar, making sure they have enough thoracic extension.
Can you elaborate a little bit on shoulder extension? Because I think that that's a pretty important movement to understand, but I think a lot of folks might not have an intuitive sense of what that actually means.
Yeah, so if you imagine, say for instance, you're doing a crab walk and you have your hands behind you essentially, you're in a position of shoulder extension. Now, when we perform a chest to bar pull-up, we have to pull our hands to our chest. And if you think about the angle that your shoulder is at in that position, you're in quite a lot of shoulder extension. And this is something that I think is probably fairly neglected by CrossFit athletes. There's a lot of focus on shoulder flexion, so going overhead, and going into shoulder extension. There's not necessarily as much focus placed on that, and I typically see that with, for instance, athletes just not being able to hold like good bridge positions. If they're going through something like a crab walk, they're always complaining of not being able to lock their elbow properly because of their bicep is tight. Generally within a chest to bar pull-up, you want to make sure that you have enough shoulder extension through that position, so sort of when you are pulling. And then as well as that, you want to be able to make sure that you hold good basic positions like an arch hold or a hollow hold, especially if you're going to be going through something like a butterfly pull-up. We want to be able to hold those basic shapes, and then obviously we need to then start thinking about how can we move through those dynamically. Quite often people just sort of do an exaggerated kipping pull-up. All of a sudden they've got a chest to bar pull-up, and there's not as much attention necessarily as placed onto the actual positions that they need to be going through. So we look at the movement itself, the sort of basic ranges of motion that are needed to create that movement. And then what we can look into is the strength requirements for a movement like that. So if you are looking to do, multiple kipping chest to bar pull-ups, you need to be able to do at least, a few strict chin over the bar pull-ups, and it probably is going to be better. It's going to serve you well and be good practice for you to try and work on pulling yourself as high as possible so that you have a contact as low as possible on the chest through a strict pull-up. Then we can look at, for instance, the muscle endurance requirements for that. So if we're looking at, CrossFit, we need to make sure that we're able to perform a number of reps, depending obviously on the task, and we need to be able to do that in a fatigued setting. So it's not necessarily about being able to do this in a every minute on the minute structure, doing 5 reps every minute for 10 minutes, that type of thing. You now need to start being able to do that under some metabolic fatigue, and you also with sort of combinations of other movements. And once you've started to develop that, we can then look at sport-specific type stuff, and actually starting to sort of threading a bit of chaos, you could call it. And, this is where you are looking at open workouts, you're looking at qualifier workouts, and really trying to understand what the volume requirements and the sort of cycle time requirements are to perform in a certain position. But bringing it back to the person who is sort of trying to transition from, I have them in a bit of a rested state, I can do a few, easier EMOM type pieces with chest to bar pull-ups, and, they're trying to now be able to express that in mixed modal work. It probably is going to serve them well to just go back through the sort of movement and the strength and the muscle endurance requirements, the sort of basic requirements there. Because quite often people skip that type of stuff, and it's very much, okay, I have the movement, now I'm just going to sort of layer on intensity, and there's not necessarily as much attention paid to these sort of basic components. And I have quite a lot of success working with athletes that have been training in sort of competitive fitness for a couple of years, and they've got a good training history under their belt, but they haven't really tapped into how to build a movement from the ground up. They've just been able to do something, and then they just want to do more, and they do more. And going through this, there's usually, one or two things that become really, really apparent when you look into the movements that people struggle with, so looking at the movement, looking at the strength, and then looking at muscle endurance and targeting those in training can actually be, quite successful in translating into the sport. But it does take time, and it does take patience.
For sure. So I think you laid out a pretty good set of steps for athletes to think about. And as you mentioned, right, someone may be able to do the movement, and we're not saying that people shouldn't be working on doing the whole movement, right? That is something that's going to be important. But simultaneously, if you think about trying to break down the specific areas that you may struggle with, you're probably going to have quicker returns on your investment of time and energy of practicing this movement if you do target the specific things that are a potential limiting factor for you, right? So if we start from the movement perspective, you did a nice breakdown of shoulder extension. And again, meaning the ability to kind of pull your elbows behind your rib cage, right? Which is going to be necessary for people to actually make contact with the bar. And you also mentioned some crab planks as a potential movement that people might struggle with if they don't have good shoulder extension range of motion. So crab plank, meaning that you are on the ground with your chest towards the ceiling, and then you press yourself up from that position, right? Rather than like a normal plank where your chest is facing the ground. So say someone does in fact struggle with something like a crab plank. They feel like that they're strong, but they have a hard time actually getting their chest to make contact with the bar when doing chest to bar pull-ups. This person, they may start to have a suspicion that shoulder extension is a missing piece for them. What should that individual be doing to potentially work on that?
Well, I think that, first and foremost, you can actually then start to make the movement and the mobility work that you do specific. Quite often people are, stretching things out, and they're just doing things just because that's what they learned. Those were the stretches that they learned when they first started CrossFit. And I think that if there's anything that should be quite individual to someone is the sort of movement work that they do. So it could be, going through, for instance, some crab planks, and then coupling that with some assisted chest to bar pull-ups with a band, doing those types of warm-up movements to warm up. And what you're doing there is you're sort of really trying to, go through the range of motion in a bit more of an aggressive sense. So you're really targeting that shoulder extension, and then all of a sudden you're going back into a movement that's going to be more specific, but isn't necessarily going to be pulling away from the session itself. So you could be looking at something like a 6 to 8 minute EMOM. On minute 1, you've got a 30-second crab plank to go through. You're trying to push into range of motion, taking it easy for the first couple of rounds and then pushing it on the last few rounds. And then on the second minute, you could be doing either some banded chest to bar pull-ups, trying to pull up as high as you can, or you could be doing some chest to bar holds, maybe with some assistance. So you could have your feet on a box, and you could sort of allocate 50% of your body weight, being managed through the upper body, 50% being managed through the lower body. And you're sort of bringing that specificity in, and it's is going to take sort of looking at it from a little bit more of an objective view. And yes, there is definitely going to be more training time spent if you're looking at things like that. But I would say it's very important for people to prioritize. So sort of bringing this back to the model, if say, for instance, you have 2 or 3 movements that you really struggle with that are definitely going to be coming up in the open, or they definitely come up in qualifier workouts that you like to do, you should try to think about the movement requirements that you need. And if there are certain things that you're unable to do, which are fairly basic, and including that stuff a couple of times a week could be, anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes of total training time. But what you are doing is you're allowing yourself to improve in the movement in a more holistic way and actually increase the sort of the trajectory that you can improve on that movement. You're actually going to be able to open up gaps of improvement that you probably wouldn't have if you were just trying to hammer more reps and EMOMs. So it's looking at it from this idea of, okay, well, what's actually preventing me here, and look at it from like a 3-month view. What can you do over the course of 3 months to try and better your position? And you could spend the first part of that time in that period really looking at things that are probably quite detached from the movement, but are a little bit more holistic.
Sure. And I think you mentioned something that's really insightful there, which is the idea of potentially doing some specific movement work like the crab plank into something that's more movement specific, right? So going, okay, I'm going to do crab planks, and then I'm going to attempt to do some sort of chest to bar drill that is appropriate for my level. Because one of the things that's most challenging about improving different ranges of motion, motor control, mobility, etc., is actually getting that to apply to someone doing the task that they're trying to improve at, right? It not that it's necessarily easy to improve, shoulder flexion, shoulder extension, hip flexion, hip extension, ankle dorsiflexion, whatever, but there's a lot of tricks that we can do that can get people to improve those ranges of motion in specific movement tests, right? Say you can't touch your toes. There's potentially a bunch of ways that we can kind of finagle your nervous system, or maybe stretch something out or whatever, and get you to be able to actually touch your toes. But getting you to be able to get into a good deadlift setup position is a much, much, much more challenging thing, right? We may say, oh, this person is struggling with hip flexion, range of motion, and motor control. We think that's impacting their deadlift setup position. Let's get them a solid toe touch, and then that's going to fix their deadlift setup. And it's just not the case like that, right? Same thing with shoulder extension, where we can say, hey, this person is really struggling here. They can't get their elbows behind their body. Their rib cage is in a pretty crazy position. Their upper back is wildly overextended, which is making it difficult for their scapula to track properly on their rib cage. So they can't actually get into shoulder extension, which means that they're having a really hard time actually making contact with the bar on a chest to bar pull-up. Let's improve that range of motion. We do that. We see improved crab plank. We see improved passive range of motion tests. We see improved active range of motion tests. But guess what? They still can't actually get their chest to touch the bar consistently, because the gap from improving that range of motion to improving the range of motion in a dynamic movement is huge. And, I don't think that there's a really solid guaranteed way to bridge that gap. But I think what you mentioned is really, really smart, which is how can we try to get these more movement and mobility drills integrated into the actual movement itself to see if we can get a little bit more of that increased range of motion to transfer over.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. And I think there's something that a lot of people, when they understand that they need to improve their movement, and they understand that they need to do some mobility and movement practices, trying to sort of bridge those gaps can be quite difficult. And, you have, for instance, mobility apps now that sort of gamify this idea of range of motion, which can be useful in sort of developing a little bit of investment in the process. But the test and what we're actually trying to get from this movement work and this mobility work is better movement in a task-specific scenario. So you're looking at, okay, if you have, I can sit into a squat and I can reach up behind me on the wall a little bit further than I could last week. But if that doesn't relate into a single arm overhead squat or an actual overhead squat, then is that useful? There's definitely you sort of have to look at things from a little bit more of a return on investment view there. For instance, I personally use a bit of a system that someone sort of presented to me when I started doing some movement and mobility work with them, and it originates from I think Gary Gray. So it's sort of looking at movement, looking at range of motion, then looking at the stability, and then applying it to the movement specifically. So it could be stretching off into some more shoulder extension. You could be then trying to sort of work on some stability in that position, a crab plank being a perfect example, right? You could be doing, some movement flow work where you're actually working on a single arm, moving around into shoulder extension to sort of develop some stability there. And then you're going to relate it to the movement, so you can then go into some chest to bar drills and something like that. So I think that relating it always back to the movement is really, really, really key. And if it's as simple as the sort of Kelly Starrett, test retest, it's bringing it back to the movement, understanding that we're not just trying to stretch off muscles and then all of a sudden we're able to do X, Y, and Z. It's thinking about what is the actual purpose behind this and bringing it back.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to mention also the idea of not just trying to get into the range of motion that we're missing, right? I mean, we can stick with the shoulder extension example. So working on crab planks, trying to find that extra range of motion, potentially doing banded distraction drills where we're, taking our arm behind our body, et cetera. Like all these things are great ways to actually get into shoulder extension, and potentially super valuable just in terms of training our brain and our nervous system that, hey, this range of motion exists. It's okay to be here. We potentially have control over it. All these things are great to actually access that range of motion when doing something like a chest to bar pull up or a muscle up or what have you. The other side of the coin is a lot of times when we have restricted range of motion in our joints, we're ending up in a situation where we may need to down regulate something else in order to find proper, joint mechanics to access these ranges of motion that we're missing. So this can be potentially a little bit abstract and difficult to talk through in a podcast format. But if we think about shoulder extension, right, the ability to pull the elbows behind the body, we can just do a quick little listener experiment. So if people are listening, and I'm just going to even do this in real life right now as well, so I can talk through it properly. But, if you have shoulder extension range of motion, you're not super restricted and you're just sitting somewhere or standing somewhere, you should be able to kind of pull your elbows behind your body, right, without getting any sort of like pinching or discomfort in the front of your shoulders. And you should be able to get at least to the point where there's, a gap between where your elbow is and where your actual torso is. Then same idea. If you try to do the exact same thing, but you arch your back and you pinch your shoulder blades down and back, you're going to have a really hard time actually getting your elbows behind your body. You're going to end up with significantly less range of motion there, right? Several degrees of range of motion are going to be gone. So it's not like in the second example where we have our back arched and our scapula pinched down and back, it's not like we suddenly, lost a bunch of shoulder extension range of motion in our actual joint. What we did is we repositioned the rib cage and put the scapula in a position where they can't actually do what they need to do in order to create shoulder extension. So a lot of times for athletes, especially in a sport like CrossFit, they end up in a position sort of, their skeleton ends up in a position that restricts their ranges of motion and makes it feel like they're tight. But what they really need to do is reposition their skeleton to enable their joints to do what they're supposed to. So, we've probably talked about this several times in the podcast in the past. We've probably written about this several times in other articles, but especially for CrossFit athletes, there tends to be a tendency to go into excessive extension of the upper back and a tendency to flare the rib cage up, which restricts scapular range of motion and makes it really hard to actually go to both go overhead and to create shoulder extension. And you see a lot of people who can actually get through those ranges of motion just based upon a lot of joint laxity. You see that in a lot of elite athletes actually, where they have pretty god-awful ribcage positioning, but they're pretty hypermobile through the shoulder girdle, so they can just kind of do stuff anyway, which may have long-term consequences for them, or it honestly may not. But for other folks who aren't quite as elite, they just end up really struggling to hit the catch position in a muscle up, to hit a catch position in a snatch, to make contact with the bar in a chest to bar pull-up. So simultaneous to some of the ideas that you're talking about, Luke, where we want to actually get into the range of motion, combine that with something like the actual chest to bar or some variation thereof, we may also want to be working in certain down regulation exercises, right? So a lot of these diaphragmatic breathing drills that people love, which honestly I think are misrepresented in terms of their benefits in a lot of cases, but one of the huge benefits that they do have is potentially helping to reposition the rib cage and get athletes out of a state of chronic thoracic overextension, right? Similarly, we can think about some more quote unquote core drills. You mentioned the hollow position. That's a great position that forces the rib cage to come down. Something like a dead bug is also an anterior core drill that can pull the rib cage down. So combining something like crab planks with dead bugs with some sort of shoulder extension focused chest to bar specific drill might be a great way to actually downregulate some of the stuff that needs to be downregulated, get into the position with your shoulders that you potentially struggle with, and then attempt to actually integrate that into the movement that you're trying to do and you're trying to improve. So, that could be a theoretical framework for improving this. And you, like you said before, you may be able to work through those in an EMOM. So you're not just sort of randomly doing these different drills and not being able to integrate them into something that actually creates improvement on the movement that you're targeting.
Yeah, I think one thing that is really difficult with doing this type of work is the fact that it does seem quite abstract. And when you're going through this type of, when people go through this type of movement work, sometimes it's very, very difficult to sort of relate it back into the thing that you're actually trying to improve. But I do think that it's something that people can get a real benefit from in just terms of applying themselves with their training. It's probably one of those things that's a little bit harder to apply yourself to and have good intention with than, say, for instance, aerobic-based work. Doing easy aerobic work, it's an intensity that you're never going to be going through in a workout. So you're like, okay, why do I do this? But after 20 minutes of it, you're dripping in sweat. So you're like, okay, cool, yeah, I like this. So this type of stuff is definitely something that people have a difficult time doing. But if you have a reasoning behind it, and if you can actually have, if you can work with someone who can actually start to, break these types of things down in a manageable way and then give you the bits of information and, then it does make it a lot easier to go through that process. And a lot of the time, really, really simple stuff just really works well. And a lot of CrossFitters don't necessarily do the simple stuff correctly. And there's always this sort of, shiny object syndrome that we're trying to get with it. But going through things like dead bugs and bird dogs and, going through some basic movement flow type work, this type of stuff, doing that over the course, of a week, every single day, just sort of giving yourself maybe 9 minutes in a warm up and you're like, okay, I'm just going to devote myself to doing this. Those types of movements can actually have a real good carryover into multiple areas. So you don't necessarily have to look at this, like I was sort of mentioning earlier, whereby you have 3 different movement EMOMs that you do in a week to improve X, Y, and Z movements. You could have a daily movement practice, which, can be hitting pretty much everything, and you could go through that in 10 minutes and you could make sure that that's going to have it's probably going to have more of an effective, it's going to be more effective than just doing some stretching just to feel better. So having some purpose around your movement work is really, really important, and the basics you can always do more of. So let's move into sort of the strength requirements for a chest to bar, and then also just start talking about that. So sort of the first one I sort of mentioned earlier with, making sure that you can actually do a strict chest to bar pull-up. We've obviously spoken a lot about the range of motion that's required for that. And I think that the sort of idea of strict before kipping is something that people understand. But one thing I would want to add to that as well is just understanding it's not necessarily about, increasing the amount of strict chest to bars that you can do in one go, or the weight that you can do for one rep. But I think that movement variability is very, very important. So being able to do it with different grips, being able to do it with different back positions. For instance, if you have, for instance, Ido Portal and sort of gymnastics strength view of doing a pull-up is, going from a complete dead hang to sort of pulling yourself up to a chest to bar and being really what I think the typical CrossFit would see as being really, really overextended. But sort of trying to get that range of motion or that strength through range of motion, I think is really important, but having variability through that so that you can hold, different positions, and also understand that it doesn't have to be just looking at strict chest to bars. You could be doing work from the rings. You could be doing different pulling positions. You could be working on different grips. You could be working with a false grip. And this is obviously going to have good transference over into other areas. And I don't really see that this is something that people have a difficult time grasping the benefit from, but I do think that variability is really, really important, especially when you're looking at gymnastic stuff, because you're going through the movement in a very, very quite a high pace, and just having the different strengths in different ranges of motion is going to be really, really important.
So if someone is at a stage where, let's say they have some strict pull-up strength, right? They can do strict pull-ups, they can do strict weighted pull-ups. Maybe they can kind of get a strict chest to bar pull-up, but it's a little weird and difficult for them. What should that individual be doing to really be building that strength specific to that movement?
Well, I think that probably looking at it from the sort of angle of, can you hold yourself in a chest to bar position first, and then working top down, similar to how people do with a strict pull-up, right? With a strict pull-up, a lot of the time people, okay, can you hold an active hang? Great. Can you hold your chin over the bar? Great. Okay, let's work through some negatives through this. One piece that I see a lot of people missing is, what do I do when I can do 5 negatives really slow? Well, you add a load of weight to it, and then you can, all of a sudden control excess of your body weight. And I think that you can apply the same principle to strict chest to bar pull-ups. So you can then start looking at it through, you can also look at it from the rings, different grips. And I think that trying to change it up quite often is probably going to be good and beneficial just for keeping people interested. You could have a 3-week progression of different styles of grips of the same movement for the same rep scheme, and most people are going to be like, okay, I sort of understand that. And all of a sudden you've extended the potential of that progression on for another 6 to 9 weeks or something like that. That's sort of how I look at it. I think that adding in enough variability to the movement is definitely going to be important, but sort of working from can you hold the isometric? Can you control it through an eccentric, so a negative? And then all of a sudden you can then start working concentric efforts, maybe with a light band, not too thick. We don't want to do that. And we can then start to add volume progressively. But what I would say is you could look at it from the angle of working strength in positions and then working strength of the actual movement itself. And you could probably do something on a Monday, working the positional strength. You could do something on the Friday, working sort of actual movement itself. And then you could move those progressively, and you could hit it from a number of different angles. And I think if you're going to be trying to develop your upper body pulling strength in CrossFit, it's going to serve you well. There's a lot of it involved. But as well as that, I think that you have to make sure that the movement is down correctly. We want to make sure that we're getting the scapula involved properly, so that we're not, just moving everything to the biceps as we start going through sort of kipping range of motions and we get tired. So we look at it from a number of perspectives as well. Do we have the muscle endurance in our scapula just actually to be able to hold that? And then that type of stuff where it's sort of more low level isometric work, we can include that in recovery workouts. You could do sort of like an EMOM structure, working through some aerobic work, some movement work, and then holding different sort of positions for an active hang. I know, Todd, you used to make me do lots of swinging around like a chimpanzee when you were coaching me. But yeah, trying to look at it from a number of different angles is going to be useful. And I think that especially when you are away from competition, you can really just sort of dive into the details on this, and you can get away from actually doing the movement itself. But I do believe that you need to practice the movement. There does need to be an element of that. But as you're going through these strength building phases, it's probably best not to be killing yourself trying to improve your more sport specific type abilities with the movement.
Yeah, so to kind of summarize that, you're thinking something like 2 times a week of actual strength work is potentially beneficial. And then you may be able to throw in some additional accessory work that is in, easier aerobic settings or not quite as fatigue based in nature. Is that an accurate summary?
Yeah, definitely. I think that if it's a priority for you in your training, or whatever movement it is that's a priority for you, then you want to make sure that you're hitting it twice a week. But then also, you can look at the session as well through sort of this lens of, what's the primary for today, what's the secondary, what's the tertiary, and you obviously have different elements of practice and strength work, which is going to be causing more or less stress on the body. So those, you could be having a focus on your snatch for the day, and then the secondary focus could be working on some of the isometrics you need to do for your chest bars. And then on the other day, the primary is going to be, I'm going to be working my strict chest bar pull-ups today with weight, something like that.
Totally. So if we have someone who is trying to work on chest to bar strength and improving shoulder extension range of motion, or improving scapular movement or something like that, how much, you sort of touched on this a little bit, but, how much should they be doing 21, 15, 9, power cleans and chest to bar pull-ups, or some, 20-minute AMRAP, 5 chest to bar pull-ups, 10 alternating pistols, 15 box jumps? How much should they be doing stuff like that that's more CrossFit-y, that's actually utilizing the chest to bar pull-up? And how much should they be saying, you know what, I'm just going to work on this in a strength and a movement and mobility context, and not be training the movement so much in a sport-specific scenario?
Yeah, I think what I do is I sort of lay it out on a bit of a timeline to make it sort of a bit easier to sort of get your head around. Say you have a competition that you're trying to peak to in 3 months, or you have a qualifier that's going to happen in 3 months. What you could do is you could say for the very first month, what you're trying to do is focus on the strength and the range of motion, and really trying to break it down like we just spoke about earlier. But then what you're doing is you're doing enough of the skill so that you don't get worse at the skill. So you're looking at it from this idea of, I need to do this just enough that it doesn't cause me to get worse at it. So that can be quite difficult though, because if you're working on a load of different other things to help this skill, and then all of a sudden you don't see the improvements in that skill, sometimes people have a hard time going through that process. For the second month, you could then say, I'm going to bring down the sessions or the amount that I'm working on the strength. I'm still going to try to improve it, but now I'm going to try and work on improving the skill of the butterfly chest to bar pull-up, and then I'm going to include it in maybe one time every week, some level of sport-specific practice, and then maybe every couple of weeks doing something fairly difficult. And then as you get, say, a month away from the period that you're trying to peak it for, which is qualifier, competition, whatever it is, that is where you may have a skill session devoted to it. You may have another workout or another 2 workouts where you have the movement involved in it. You can then start looking at things like functional volume, which I know you've spoken a lot about in the past, Todd. And that's, you would at that stage as well pull away the strength work, and whatever strength level that you have, you sort of just accept it, and you're like, okay, I need to practice the sport, and I actually need to do the work now. Because I think it's quite difficult. People sort of have these expectations of, I need to be here before I do this. And whilst that can be very, very beneficial for someone who is very new to all of this, and you're trying to make sure that you're ensuring safety in their training and they're not doing things that they shouldn't do, when you're involved in the sport and you've been doing it for a couple of years and you're actually trying to make some improvements in it, you have to go through this process of, okay, I'm going to give myself 2 months to get better at this, wherever I'm at the end of it. And, whatever sort of measurements that you're using, you sort of have to let go of them, and then you have to play the sport. And then you come off the back end of that, you deload, and you think, okay, is this a priority? Do I still need to do this? And then you go back into it. I think a lot of people, they come away from those periods of training where they've been really trying to push something, and they expect to see the return on it straight away. And sometimes the return on it doesn't happen straight away. And it might be after you've had your competition or your qualifier workouts, you've deloaded a little bit, you get back into a little bit of structured training, and then all of a sudden you could be like, all right, I feel so much stronger through this, and I can do 5 more kilos through this movement or something like that. So, you may not see the return on it straight away, but you would just try to make sure you're hitting the movement, say 3 times a week. And for the first period, you're looking at it very much from a movement quality, strength perspective. Do enough of the movement so you don't get worse of it. Then you sort of transition to more of a bit of a 50-50. And then you go into something which is like, okay, I'm just going to do this in a workout scenario.
Yeah, I think that another useful heuristic to think about, actually, you mentioned the idea of like, okay, where are you in the season, and that can kind of dictate how you do things, and then potentially, how much you actually struggle with this, because people who are pretty good but like have a few things that need to clean up, like they can potentially benefit from having more of their time allocated to doing sport specific scenarios, whereas people for whom every time you do chest to bar pull-ups, your shoulders hurt for 7 days, like, okay, that's someone who may need to make a different calculation based upon that. But yeah, I think the other heuristic that might be useful for folks to think about sort of has to do with where your kind of, set point is for thinking about these things, right? So coaches who listen to this podcast, who probably tend to be more analytical and like to have training progressions and templates for things and, lay out the perfect progression and how things are going to work. Folks like that, I think, tend to err on the side of not doing enough sport specific work, right? That they think that, oh, okay, well, the chest to bar pull-up is made up of shoulder extension and the arch to hollow and a certain amount of strength and a little bit of skill work. And if we just work each of those pieces individually, like, we're going to obviously make the whole thing better, which is not necessarily true, right? That as you mentioned, you have to do a certain amount of sport specific work in order for it to make sense and in order for it to integrate. So I think coaches who are on the more analytical end will err too far on the side of not doing enough sport specific work. And then clients who, tend to be a little bit, bullheaded in terms of their desire to do workouts that they see online, or to feel intensity, or to not feel like they're losing capacity in things, are potentially going to err too far on the side of wanting to do things that look like the sport that they're playing. And those folks may benefit from being willing to say, you know what, I might actually get worse at 20-minute AMRAPs that involve chest to bar pull-ups over the course of 3 months, but hopefully in 5 months, I'm a lot better than I would have been because I actually took time off from doing them in conditioning workouts in order to improve my range of motion and motor control and my actual strength in this movement. And so I think those are the two sides that people tend to fall into. And there's not necessarily a clear, perfect answer for exactly where people should sit. But I will say, from my perspective as an overly analytical coach, I've certainly started to err more on the side of just giving people things that look like their sport to play with the movement. But that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of clients who only want to do intensity and only want to do things that look like open workouts, and that those folks need to calm down a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. I think I've been sort of in two camps, and it's weird as well, like sort of going through things as an athlete previously, and sort of my own training. I definitely felt that I needed to do more of this, and this, and then when I look at, say, for instance, the training that I give people, there's definitely been elements that have been too over analytical, and similar to yourself, the sort of longer I've gone through this. I remember back in the day, I think maybe like 6 years ago, people were talking about having, complete off seasons where you don't touch a Metcon, and there was sort of that's very one side of the extreme. And then people were saying, well, you still actually need to do the sport. And if you look at, say, for instance, the training of the elite these days, that idea of sort of off season, in season type stuff, you can't really see it in the sort of training programs and things like that. It just looks like they're doing a lot of CrossFit all the time, which they are. They just may have a bit of a different focus here and there.
Totally. So in conclusion, chest to bar pull-ups have a lot of different pieces. You may want to think about the pieces that make up that movement, right? So the actual ranges of motion that are going to be necessary. If you are lacking in any of those, it may be beneficial for you to do some specific movement work, particularly focused on something like shoulder extension, shoulder flexion, thoracic extension, scapular movement, and then kind of pair it with some more skill focused work on that chest to bar pull-up, right? So that you can actually hopefully integrate those pieces together. If you struggle with strength and upper body pulling, particularly in something like a strict chest to bar pull-up, it might be beneficial to actually take 2 days a week and focus on strength alone in that movement without doing a bunch of conditioning volume that's going to potentially impair your ability to do quality strength work. And over time, the exact ratio of sport-specific scenarios and sport-specific skill work to more movement and strength-focused work, like the ratio between those is going to need to be adjusted based upon where you are in the season, how good you are at the movement, how much volume you can tolerate, and whether or not there's negative consequences to you doing sport-specific skill work on it. But that those knobs need to be twisted up and down a little bit, and that you may see the actual sport-specific skill decline if you're focusing more on movement quality and strength. But that if that is the decision that you're making, ideally that results in you having more sport specific skill and capacity in 3 months time. Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com, and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.